I'd like to acknowledge that Railroads is situated on the traditional territories of the Chrysopsum and Lekwungen families. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that teaching and learning at Railroads seeks daily to integrate the ways of knowing and ways of being of these families into our teaching and learning and our classroom practices. Since we're joining virtually today, I also would like to acknowledge all of you to encourage all of you to acknowledge the traditional families and communities that have used the lands on which you work and you live since ancestral times. So, and I'd like to welcome our guest panelists and introduce them. First, I'll give you an intro as to what the objective of the webinar is. We've all lived through the COVID crisis and had to do lots of jugglings and lots of creative teaching and learning during this pivot, what's now known as the pivot. We are still at different stage, depending on which province you're in, at either being fully online, being fully face-to-face in new health provisions, or being at some level of blended instruction. It has been great in some ways because it has pushed for obviously integration of technology and embracing various practices, which the field was maybe hesitant with. But we also have to pause now that we're 9 months into the pivot and look at some of the injustices and some of the issues with regards to inclusion. And so the aim of the webinar today is to really, give an opportunity to the 4 panelists to reflect on what maybe has not always gone perfectly right during this pivot and what we can learn from these lessons, and to see where UDL fits in maintaining inclusive provisions, even when we have to have extraordinary measures, even when we have to be on blended, even when we have to be online. So that's what the sort of questions I'll be addressing to our panelists. So there are 3 panelists plus myself as a panelist and facilitator. So first we have Margaret Flood. Margaret joins us. She's the Education Officer for Inclusive Education Diversity at the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment in Ireland. And she's been involved in quite a bit of UDL work. I've done some work in Ireland too, and I got to get to know her. So she'll introduce herself in a moment and explain her background with UDL. Then we have Christina. Christina is a PhD candidate to University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's a Fulbright scholar and was recently in Chile looking at inclusive provision and UDL in that context. She has also worked with incarcerated youth and has done some work previously with CAST as well. And I've had lots of opportunities to work with Christina in respect to UDL. And then we have Andrea Hoopers, which is joining us from Quebec. Christina is in the US, so I forgot to mention. Andrea is in Quebec, and she's the Assistive and Accessible Technology Consultant at English Montreal School Board. And she's also the co-founder of Innovate Educational Consulting. And I have met Andrea numerous times in the past too in Quebec, and she's been involved with UDL and assistive technology for a long time now, so has a lot of expertise to bring on this subject. So welcome to this, and myself, I'm the program head for the MELM program and associate professor within the School of Technology, School of Education Technology at Royal Roads. And again, will be the last panelist. I'll give my opinion to our position, but I'll mostly be facilitating the questions for our 3 other panelists. So we've got a few questions which were prepared for the panelists, and we're going to go through them in sequence. And the first question is going to enable our panelists to also tell you a little bit more about themselves and the work that they have done with UDL. So I've asked them to think about this question: what attracts you to UDL as practitioners and researchers? And you know, what does it mean for you as well? So we haven't set an order, but I see Christina at the top of my screen, so we'll begin with Christina if you'd like.
Sure. Hey, everyone. As Frederic said, I'm currently in the US, living in Watertown, which is outside of Boston on Massachusetts and Wampanoag land. What attracts me to UDL, you know, I got into my field, which is special education, inclusive education, as a practitioner, and as a practitioner felt like UDL was a life raft, like it put things together, put things into words that I was having trouble articulating as a new teacher. And now as a researcher, I mean, I definitely, you know, I always go back to teaching. It's part of my identity as a researcher in education for sure. But now as a researcher, I feel like what keeps me attracted to UDL is that I also see it as a roadmap for this often used idea of change yourself to change the world. So UDL helps me think about my own thinking, about how I approach interpersonal relationships with students and colleagues, and how I can examine and work to create systems change level as well. So I like that it connects all those levels of the education system.
Thank you, Christina. I think we'll go to Andrea, and we're making up the order as we go. Andrea, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Bonjour from Quebec. I'm very happy to be here today. So I have a background in special education as well. I'm a teacher by background. I was always working in classrooms for students specifically with you know, a range of abilities. So my background has been with students with learning disabilities, with autism spectrum disorders, very much you know, my background is very much you know, in both healthcare and education. So I've had a really wide variety of teaching experiences, which I think has really brought me to the UDL framework, I guess. Or really, I think UDL, when I was first you know, introduced to UDL, it really encapsulated everything that I had experienced as a teacher. And what I've done for many years is I've been in different, I guess, roles working with the UDL framework. I've been an administrator. I've been a project coordinator for a UDL project at the Ministry of Education in Quebec. And now I feel that I'm hands-on with UDL. My work is very much focused on working with students every day and with teachers every day in the classroom with the UDL framework as a guide. And what I like about UDL is that it's a very approachable framework. It's not an instructional guide. It's not a how-to. It's really, it's a framework which works well for teachers. And I think, you know, teachers have found it something that they can relate to and something they can apply in the classroom. And it's the first framework, I think, that really makes sense for teachers in terms of, you know, the range of abilities, of student abilities in their classroom. Okay, so I'm going to speak today very much from a practitioner perspective. I'm very much, I think, in the trenches right now, enjoying being in the trenches, but it's hard work. But I think I'm going to speak to that experience today. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrea. And over to Margaret, who's joining us from Ireland, where it's quite late in the evening already.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Frederic, for inviting me here today and tonight here in Ireland. Again, I'm coming from a practitioner and a researcher perspective, so dual hats on me this evening. From that practitioner perspective, I was a special education teacher for 17 years, and I just left the classroom 4 years ago. And for me, I love that Christina talked about that life raft, because I was one of those teachers at sea, treading water and quickly losing my energy, trying to find what would work for my students. I was so tired of having to create different programs, take them out of class so that they could do their learning, and put them into classrooms for socialization, where they weren't learning, they were there to be there, and knowing in my heart of hearts that wasn't inclusion, and they knew that they were different. So I got into the UDL life raft by accident. There was no thought or reason or rhyme to it. I fell upon it. I realized that some of the things that UDL was talking about is what I had been doing in my classroom, but I didn't have a name for it. So once I found a name for it, it meant that I could dig deeper and I could start looking into it more, and I could start applying it in a more strategic and a more meaningful approach for my students. As a researcher, what I love about UDL is that it is moving us away from thinking in terms of checklists and thinking in terms of approaches and strategies for different types of students. So if you're dyslexic, you do this. If you've autism, you do that. UDL is about doing all of it for everyone, and I love that. And as a researcher, I always think of the language of UDL, because that is what is is framing my mindset when I am approaching it, and when I am looking at different approaches that I might want to use. In Ireland, we're still very much talking about differentiation at primary and post-primary stage. So I'm very interested in seeing how teachers in the coming years move away from that differentiation checklist mindset to this more inclusive for everyone state of mind, and just working, and again, and Christina said it, that roadmap, working on a roadmap for Ireland at a national level towards a more UDL approach in our classrooms.
Thank you, Margaret. And so I'm Lars, and I'll just again explain how I came to UDL and what it means for me. Obviously, I've worked in inclusion for a long time in my career too, and so I've worked with learners with learning disabilities, for example, from a disability lens. But before that, my original interest, really both as a practitioner and as a researcher, has been social emotional behavior difficulties. So working with kids that were excluded from schools for challenging behavior. And it's actually there, like Margaret, I sort of stumbled onto UDL, and it became very important for me to rethink engagement, rethink the engagement piece. And it started me on this reflection, which is very UDL based, that maybe it's not something that's wrong with the students, but it's something wrong with the way we deliver instruction to them and the way we are actually, sort of formulate and frame schooling. It's also really interesting for me, UDL, in the sense that it now offers a wide spectrum and to look at social injustices within schools. It doesn't just restrict the notion of inclusion just to students with disabilities, but really enables you to rethink inclusion from the perspective of any learner, learners that are racialized, learners that are facing poverty, LGBTQ2S+ students. Really, it's a lens that you can apply for the inclusion of all of these learners. And finally, what I find the most powerful about UDL is, as opposed to any other framework for inclusion, such as individualized learning, differentiated instruction, it forces the onus back on the teacher to adopt a designer hat and really to take that responsibility to do things differently, rather than putting the focus on the exceptionality of the learner. And it's really the only framework that forces, that kickstarts that reflection, which is, I find, a very healthy reflection. So that closes the first round on this question, which now allowed you to get to know us a little bit better and to see what drew us to this. We're now going to go on to the next question. And this has been a very troubling 9 months for most people in most jurisdictions that have been involved in schooling. So I'm asking the panelists if they could tell us a little bit about examples of some of the issues with inclusion that have occurred in this COVID climate. And then we'll go on to how UDL could be helpful there. But first of all, to discuss some of the examples that they've come across in the last 9 months of things that are of concern if you're an inclusion specialist. So I guess, again, Christina, you want to kick us start?
Sure. So there's so much to say here. I guess what is top of mind for me is here in Boston, they're trying to reopen schools on Monday. So I've just been sort of steeped in some of the conversations related to that. And, the situation here, as in other districts, is that they're talking about, as they did in September when the school year started, before they had to close in this second wave, they're talking about bringing back, quote unquote, high needs students first. And amongst those students with high needs are students in the foster care system, students who are homeless, and students with disabilities. But they're also sort of prioritizing by type of disability. And I don't pretend to have, real answers or solutions here or anything, just to be super clear. But from my perspective, which is a UDL perspective, I feel like always that's how I interpret things at this point. This approach reinscribes a really limited view of the purpose of schooling, a really limited view of learner variability, right? As if we could put, all the students within a certain special education categorization within the same boat. And it's really disconcerting to me because I think, you know, one of the things that maybe many of us come to believe with UDL is that, like, there are other ways often to think about things and do things when we know that we can anticipate and design for learner variability in advance. So I'll stop there. I mean, I'm happy to, you know, jump back in and be in conversation with other people. But to summarize, I think one of my main concerns is the way the current COVID context is actually facilitating a kind of reinscription of the rigid special education system that we know actually has very problematic outcomes when viewed from an intersectional perspective for a lot of learners here in the States.
Thank you, Christina. And do feel free to jump back in at the end if there's anything that we've missed and that you'd like to add. Andrea has been in the trenches in Quebec and probably has lots of stories to tell us.
I do have lots of stories. If we have about 10 hours for this webinar, I could, you know, but that's okay. I think Christina brought up some excellent points. Where to start, really. But I think what's really important to think about is that no one really had a choice here in terms of moving to remote instruction. You know, Quebec is, we have most of our students in person right now. I guess we're very different than, you know, than many of the states in the US, and that all of our elementary students are in school right now full time. It was like that from the very beginning of September. We had 2 months of remote instruction, 2 to 3 months in the spring of remote instruction. Then our government decided to go full time for elementary students in September, and a blended learning model for our high schools. So it looks a little bit different here, but we've had the opportunity to learn from those, I guess, those contexts. What we know is that, you know, no one had a choice in any of this, and we know that with regards to remote instruction, when there's no choice, it's very difficult. So our teachers were forced to adapt very quickly to remote instruction and blended learning models. And we know there's not enough support for our teachers. Our teachers are very, very aware that, you know, it's very difficult for them. And they've said flat out, we feel this is like our first year of teaching. You know, even teachers who are very, very experienced pedagogues are saying, I feel like I'm just starting out. So it's been a very big shift in instruction and pedagogy for our teachers and for our learners as well. And my concerns are our learners who have significant needs have, I think, very much been left behind in the remote learning situations where, you know, we see decreased independence. We see parent support, you know, that is not just, parents are not able to support their children. Some are working outside of the home. You know, they're very stressed to begin with. So there's a lot of issues there. There's also inequities that we see. I think the pandemic has brought up the issue, or the real issue of inequity in education, in terms of some students not having access to Wi-Fi, to devices, to parent support. And that's just the reality of the situation. I'm sorry about that. Sorry about that. So it's just been very, I think, very, very difficult for teachers and learners. In the classroom, we see that there is a reduction in collaboration, which is very, very key. We see teaching models that we've been forced to put into practice that we haven't used in many years. You know, teachers teaching in rows, you know, in those learning spaces that were designed now for collaboration. So it's very difficult because teachers realize that we're sort of regressing back to those pedagogies that we must use, but we don't want to use. So I'm going to stop there. I could go on. I'm going to pass it over.
Jump back in if you wish at the
end.
Okay. Yeah, and Margaret, what about your lessons from Ireland?
Andrea, I think I'm going to go on for you
Okay.
because I'm going to pick up right where you left off in terms of technology and the blended learning. First of all, I'm going to say, thankfully here in Ireland, our schools opened at the end of August and have managed to remain open, even though we went into a second lockdown. So, and that's testament to the amazing teachers and the work they're doing in the schools. But last March, when they were all thrown in front of a computer and told to teach from home and teach all of your students from home, they were thrown in front of this computer with no upskilling. And actually everything that came out in Ireland was around looking after your students' well-being, or drama around assessments. The key focus was on assessments, which goes back to Christina's point about excluding certain groups or ring fencing them, because if you weren't sitting a state exam, you weren't a priority at the time. What has happened since is when teachers went back to school in September, then all the CPD on technology came into the fore, but they were actually back in classrooms. And the struggle for the teachers back in the classrooms, as you said, Andrea, they couldn't teach the way they used to teach before COVID hit. And a primary teacher friend of mine was telling me a story one day about one of her students with special educational needs. She didn't know if she needed to be teaching the student catch up with her second class maths or doing her current third class maths. And she also couldn't bend down to help her with her functional skills. She couldn't bend down to help her place her ruler properly on the page so that she could participate in the activity with her peers. And they're the things that teachers are struggling with at the moment. And I think they're the things that teacher educators really need to be focusing on at the moment. In terms of exclusion, absolutely, the gap has just widened since COVID. I think it's brought us back 10 years. I think in terms of access to technology and teachers' understanding. So when you were in your class on March 12th, you were standing in front of all your students and you saw them face to face. On March 19th, when you were in front of a computer, you still expected all your students to be sitting there in front of a computer, but not doing all those active things that they would have done with you in a classroom. And that created an awful lot of tension, cameras being off, muted cameras, poor internet connection, students not being able to access a Word document that was sent to them because they only could access Zoom or Teams or whatever it was on their mobile phone. So they couldn't open the document that was in front of them. And that was the students who were able to use technology. For our students with real complex needs, parents were actually reporting to their teachers that they couldn't communicate with them because the teachers had all those nuances in terms of communicating during their educational day. So they found it really, really difficult to support any sort of learning at home. Plus families were dealing with not being in work, working from home themselves, and all of these extra things. But what still came to the fore on top of all of this was, let's get the exam students out so that they can get their points, they can get to college, and we'll deal with the gap later. But the gap was just getting wider. And I think that's still happening even in blended learning situations. And my friend's story, which she told me very early in September about her student and that ruler, still sticks with me. And we're now December, coming to our Christmas holidays, and those examples are still happening in the classrooms. So really, if we want to be able to include every one of our diverse learners, we really need to start with the teachers now, and we really need to be putting in the professional learning and professional development to build not even their capacity, but their confidence to know that they're already doing this, and that it's okay if half the class have their cameras off, if a class is 20 minutes instead of 40 minutes, that you're still doing an awful lot of learning in that time, and just being creative about what you're putting up there virtually so that every learner can access it. And just think, I did this face-to-face, I'll adapt it a little bit, I'll tweak it, and therefore we'll be able to do it online. I was at a conference and I heard somebody said to me, it takes 6 weeks to form a habit. So Andrea, as you said, if we're going back to that talk and chalk, we formed that habit before we even got to our Easter break. So we really need to start working on bringing back all of the good habits that we've spent years developing, so that when COVID is over and we're back to normal, that we're ready to get back into being inclusive educators in our classrooms.
Thank you, Margaret. So I'm going to piggyback a lot of the comments that have already been brought up, but obviously a great concern of mine is the over emphasis on diagnostic information again. It seems, as all of you said, we are going back a few decades, and this obviously leads to heightened stigmatization. The loss of social capital, I think, is really worrying in the sense that it's at the heart of teaching, and often now because of emerging measures, we've now put it down the row of priorities, but it should be something which is essential in all of the activities that we create, and it can be done with technology, but people just don't have yet the skills or the training, as you've been mentioning. Obviously, the obvious is for teachers that have had to switch to blended learning or online learning. There's been great issues with accessibility of content, going back to having to create awareness around, even accessibility to PDFs and captioning and, description for images and things like this, but also the accessibility of the design of the activities. I think a lot of teachers, for lack of support and lack of training, have assumed that, as you've said, Margaret, whatever they did in the classroom, they could just transfer to a different platform, and that doesn't happen, right? There needs to be a redesign, sort of thinking that happens there, to see what you keep, what you change, what you alter, what you modify, and that hasn't always happened. And this has led to issues with engagement. I think the problem at the moment is that we've sort of accepted that the engagement piece isn't important because we're so focused on emergency measures. But we're not going to be able to retain these kids in education if we don't focus back on engagement. And here I'm going to look back to the comment that Christina put up, that in the US, some US studies, 25% of students are already just disappearing from statistics. This is going to have a huge impact on school dropouts. Yes, we're succeeding in emergency measures for a percentage of our students, but there's a lot of students it's not working for, and unfortunately they may never come back. Then, of course, there's wider societal issues. You've probably looked at, seen and heard about these learning pods, which has exacerbated social injustices, that some families have access to that hub of parental support, others have none at all. And unfortunately, as schools, as institutions, we've tended to over-rely on parental support and assume that every student has access to parental support, which isn't the case, obviously. And lastly, I would say that something that worries me greatly from just a legal point of view is that for us in Canada, the Human Rights Charter has a clause which is the undue hardship, and allows basically institutions and organizations to not comply with legislative imperatives on inclusion if there's a reason that is sort of force majeure. There's bound to be some cases at the moment because a lot of organizations and a lot of schools and school boards are flirting very, very close to not providing and not meeting their legislative imperative. And so we can only suppose that there will be a flow of cases related to human rights, where a lot of institutions are going to shelter themselves behind the undue hardship and said, well, we had no choice and we couldn't do it in any other way. So before we go to the other question, I don't know if anyone wants to jump back in, if there's anything we've missed on this or that you'd like to add.
I wanted to, sorry if I could just add to that. I wanted to just add that we talked about the concerns. There's so many concerns with regards to COVID, but there are some positives, I have to say, that we've seen in terms of diversity. And I think some of those are that what we realized actually, just recently, is that remote learning actually is good for some of our students. And it was sort of a very, we sort of made this discovery, just by, working, our teachers have very close relationships with their students. And I think online, they've really tried to develop those relationships even more, because it is much more difficult online to do that. So through these really strong relationships, we found that some of our students who might have had, high anxiety, who might, work well in the context of remote learning, were very much enjoying that experience and benefiting from that experience. So that's been something positive. And I think the realization that learning, again, doesn't look like one specific model, which is what we were just discussing. Learning can look like so many different things. And I think out of this pandemic, it's been so stressful, but at the same time, we're really looking at different types and models of learning. And that's been, I think, key. It's really forced us to go there. And it's forced us very quickly to go there. So I think there will be some lessons learned from this pandemic. And I don't think education will ever be the same again after this. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Andrew. And it's definitely a great segue into the spin we're going to take at this point. Obviously, the point is not to keep the webinar looking at some of the challenges that have occurred in the last 9 months. We've all lived them, but to see what sort of positive lessons and especially how UDL might be useful in spinning this around and actually finding opportunities in the landscape that has presented lots of challenges. So the next question is about, to all the panelists, is to tell me whether you've seen examples of educators that have successfully been using UDL during these COVID times, and in which creative ways have they used them to keep this focus on inclusive education. Christina, do you want to start with you again?
Sure. So I think that I'm trying to kind of get my thoughts together here because I'm trying to figure out if I want to talk about higher ed or K-12. But I'll just say that so this semester, you know, as you mentioned, I'm in graduate school, and this semester I was teaching Introduction to Special Education online, right? And it's a project-based course. So it culminates in students presenting a viable public product that is a group created work. And in this case, it was related to the impacts of, so the federal protections that we have here in education law for disabilities and their intersections during this time with COVID-19. And I will say that, you know, it was really interesting as a instructor who's like an elder millennial. It was really interesting to see the way my college age students, my undergraduate students, used technology to create these products in ways that, like, you know, I put tools out there for them. I tried to sort of curate, you know, media manipulation tools like video editors, collaborative media editors, interactive timeline tools, tools for making infographics, et cetera. And they really like took those and ran or flowed, however you want to think about it, right? And the things that they produced were some of the best. I've TA'd this course. It's capped at 150 students. I've taught it. So I've seen a bunch of these projects over the years. And this year actually was some of the best ones that I had ever seen. So, you know, I also think that, just to sort of share one other thing about a practical example and the perpetual screen off, screen on dilemma, issue, question, right? You know, as an instructor rooted in UDL, I always reiterated that having cameras off was a completely understandable option with everything that we have going on. But I also really used the principles related to engagement, the guidelines related to engagement, to like both minimize the threats and distractions associated with having, you know, your screen off or on, but also to encourage connection whenever I could with my students who were able to turn their screens on. And I feel like in some ways, I actually, as Andrea kind of mentioned, like there were these surprises in terms of just, you know, when you're teaching a huge lecture class, you get to maybe meet the students that come up afterwards, you know. But this way I actually got a lot of more interaction with my students in their small groups, which was really kept me going as the instructor, because as we all know too, like when you have to just monologue to a series of names on the screen, that's also hard, you know. So that's kind of just what came to mind, like building on the UDL principle of engagement, giving multiple options for action and expression, that I think actually really empowered the students to do creative work in ways that was really exciting.
Thanks, Christina. Andrea, what were some of the observations you made of colleagues and teachers doing well with UDL when they're facing these challenges?
Okay, so I think the example I'll give will be in the area of technology, because I'm an assistive and accessible technology consultant and teacher. So I think what I've seen is just really novel ways of using technology to explore the 3 principles of universal design for learning. So an example, a practical example I can give is the use of something called hyperdocs. I don't know if everyone's familiar with hyperdocs, but hyperdocs are used in a remote learning situation, and they're documents that are provided to students that sort of include the whole learning cycle. Okay, so they would include links to interactive resources, websites, video, text, different ways to demonstrate understanding. So it's really, it's a lesson plan that includes sort of all the elements of the learning cycle. And teachers often use the framework of explain, apply, it's explore, explain, apply. That's really the design of a hyperdoc. And within that framework, teachers have really gone the distance and have really designed these incredible hyperdocs to allow students to demonstrate understanding in multiple ways. Also to teach content and to teach, to allow for different methods of representation. So we've seen all kinds of different incredible, really, remote learning situations that teachers have designed so that students can be more engaged and it can be more of an interactive lesson for students that are working remotely. So I think that model, UDL has been used really effectively to design some really excellent remote learning experiences. And we're just starting to sort of, it's really just the start of something really incredible, I think. We're seeing some real changes and some incredible things in terms of remote learning, but we're at the very, very beginning of that. Because, as we progress with more virtual learning, more remote learning, we're going to see really good examples of using the UDL framework for lesson design. So I think that's just, that's a practical example of using technology. What I'm also seeing is an increase in accessibility. So Frederic had mentioned that, we're sort of going back to the basics and explaining accessibility and discussing why that's so important. But I'm seeing a huge boom in teachers and practitioners in education saying, hey, accessibility is really key now. We need these accessible PDFs. We need these, OCR tools that, we're using them all the time. I've never been so busy trying to access, accessible textbooks, workbooks for students. We're using Bookshare for accessible novels with our students. I don't think I've had a busier year, which is just amazing. I mean, it's just incredible to see. And the awareness has just really, I'd say, exploded. So that's been really excellent and really positive. I'm going to stop there. I could give many more examples, but maybe I'll kick in later.
Thanks, Andrea. And we'll come back to that in the last question in terms of how will we keep that momentum going, right, with all of these changes, but we'll return to that. Margaret, what were your observations?
For me, it went back to the principle of engagement, and again, access that everybody has talked about tonight, and very simple things like your students could be accessing your lesson in a different room in the house every time you meet them, giving them 2 minutes to settle in, telling them what materials they're going to need, giving them two minutes to gather everything and settle themselves. And then going into the access camera on, camera off, using chat, being allowed to eat and drink, telling them it's okay to get up from your chair during the lesson. Those simple things that students knew they could do in the classroom, but maybe don't understand that they can still do it when they're face to face with you on a camera. And then using the private chat. I think we've got to remember those quiet students in the classroom, and it goes back to what Andre says about some of the students really coming out of themselves in remote learning, because maybe that shy person who's afraid to put up their hand and ask a question in front of everybody in the class can use the private chat and can ask the teacher separately, so that they're not asking, it's not coming up in the group chat, and the teacher can support them individually while the rest of the students are doing their work. In terms of choice around action and expression, I think teachers in a good way have been pushed to really challenge themselves in this area. So they're getting them in, they're keeping them there, but how are they getting them to demonstrate their knowledge and their understanding? And a 2-page essay just isn't going to work at the moment. So it is telling them to use PowerPoints, doing iMovies, using Mentimeters. Frederic, I know that that's a favorite of yours for starting a session. And it's a great way of checking in, but doing all of these different things. And then finally, breakout rooms. When you're in a classroom, you don't stand and talk to 25, 35 students individually for the length of your classroom. You tell them work at their tables and you tell them do group work. And I think at the moment that might be the biggest fear of teachers, because they're putting them into a virtual room where they can't be with them the entire time. And again, because of lack of training, teachers don't all know that you can actually dip in and out of the breakout rooms and check in with them that way. But it's a great independence builder for the students to say, teacher actually is trusting us. She can't stand in the top of the classroom and watch us do our group work. She's trusting us to go into this virtual room and work by ourselves. So actually we want to show him or her or them that we can do it. I'm going to stop there because I just agree with everything else Andrea and Christina has said on this question.
Super. Thanks so much, Margaret. I'm just going to add a few points. Yeah, I think it's finally exhausted. I think, especially because it's lasted so long now, COVID. Teachers focus on synchronous instruction, and I think people now are starting much more relaxed about doing all sorts of creative recipes where there's synchronous, non-synchronous, and I think that's been great in getting teachers through that wall sometimes, which was limiting them. Been a great development when I look at teachers that I have in my classes at master's level, a great development in problem-based learning on PBL. And that's great, because often sometimes teachers were still hesitant to adopt project-based learning, but now they've really thrown their hearts into it. As Andrew had mentioned, it's made a lot of teachers understand that technology is a necessary affordance for a lot of our students with disabilities, particularly students with mental health issues and anxiety issues. And so that's been great too, because we've tended to be negative about technology and said, it increases, trolling, stress and anxiety and harassment, but it has some enormous potential for some of our students who really depend on it. So I think it's highlighted that. As Margaret has said, I think there's been a huge rethink around engagement. We've been very narrow-minded in schools to think that engagement is eye contact, raising your hand, being very present physically. And it's encouraged teachers to really rethink and come up with non-teacher-centric conceptions of what engagement is. And that engagement can be demonstrated in multiples of ways. And that's where UDL has been very useful. I think, as Christina has mentioned, that it's humanized that relationship. She talks about, seeing teachers with their pets and their families. I think, as Margaret mentioned too, it's enabled people to do that option of, I want to have a quick chat with you in a personal, personalized chat in a private room, and we can do that. And that's become much more common, and that was probably not present in before COVID. So I think it's been really useful in emphasizing that UDL and UDL sort of lesson. But I think the greatest takeaway is that because everyone is affected by COVID, it's also broken through that it's not just students with disabilities that face barriers. At the moment, it's any student that is facing barriers. And I think that's been a great shake-up for people to be less intrusive, not need diagnosis information, to actually realize that there's a lot of people out there for a multitude of reasons might be hindered in their access to learning during COVID. And hopefully that will have some impact on the future as well. One quick...
say something?
Yep.
I just wanted to add, because I think what Margaret mentioned at the end about these breakout rooms is so important. And I think this complements what you just said too about, non-teacher centric. The goal of UDL, right? The overarching goal in UDL, we always talk about the goal is to build expert learners, right? So this idea too, that we can let the learners go is huge. And it reveals too, the default for many of us is to be teacher centric, but and learning, to be clear too, for students is scary if they don't have the tools to be expert learners. But I think that's also kind of been one of the exciting things potentially about this time is giving more opportunities for students to develop that expertise.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. The next question is going to be quite short, but I thought that it would be useful to have a sort of a hands-on question too. So in times of COVID, and we're still most of us in COVID and pandemic situations, if you are a participant today and you've not experimented with UDL in enormous amounts, or if you're supporting teachers and you want to introduce them to UDL, what would be, to our panelists, what would be the first step that you would encourage them to do in the current context, something that would be immediately useful to them in terms of implementation of UDL?
Okay, so I think the first thing to think about is if you're a teacher right now is really just to reflect on your own practice, because I think teachers know teachers are really the experts on their own, their own learning as well. And, I feel that, asking a colleague or a mentor to sort of to help you reflect on your own practice is also helpful as well. What's been helpful in our context is really coaching and mentorship. That's been really key in the context of the pandemic. Teachers being there for each other and having confidence that they themselves are the ones that can, solve a problem, develop curriculum, design. So I think just reflecting on your own practice as a teacher is really key in terms of implementation of UDL. So what are you already doing that, I guess fits within the UDL framework? And I think so many teachers are already doing that, and they might not even realize they are doing that. And I think the shift in perspective is really key, because I think when I first started with implementing the UDL framework, it was really a shift from, I don't remember who had mentioned it, but I think it was really, perhaps it was Frederic, just mentioning that, the barrier is not the learner, him or herself, it's really the environment. The environment of the student can be, the barriers can be reduced in the environment, and really that's what's going to make the difference. And that's a shift in perspective. So I think looking into that shift is really key, and looking at the ways that we can reduce barriers for students in the environment is really key. And the last thing I'm going to mention is really, I think taking a personalized approach to learning is really important as well. And I just recently attended a session at ISTE, which is a very big technology conference, with Kathleen McClaskey. And she had a really interesting perspective on using the UDL lens, I should say, for personalized learning. And so I think really understanding your students, really knowing where they're at, really understanding them as people, having that really deep relationship with them, social and emotional learning in the classroom, really key. So I think really she talked about using learning surveys with her students. So I think starting there and really understanding your students as learners goes a long way towards implementing UDL in the classroom. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you.
Margaret?
Yeah, the first thing I would tell teachers is take a breath. Just pause, look at what you're doing, and ask yourself, what are you doing well? And then I would say, ask yourself, what can you do to improve on that? If anyone here ever goes to the CAS symposiums, they always talk about Sunday, someday. And if it was Sunday evening, what one little thing would you change in your lesson plans for Monday to make it better for every student in your classroom? And then think about what the bigger picture, what you would like that lesson to look like to be truly inclusive someday. And every Sunday, make a little change and build on it. Recognize that you don't have to do UDL in one big sweep. Some people look at the UDL guidelines and they look across all of the checkpoints and they think checklist straight away. And they think, oh my God, I have to do all of this and I have to do it now. First of all, you're already doing some of it, like I was, but I was calling it something differently. And you choose what is working for your students in this current climate. In terms of barriers, I would be asking myself as a teacher, what barriers is technology, is the laptop, the mobile phone, whatever, what barriers is that creating, and how can I first of all work to fix that? And we've talked about all of that already. We've talked about the accessibility, allowing them to turn their cameras on and off, all of those different things. And if I was to send them to, I'd send them to 2 places. I'm not gonna lie, I'd send them to 3 places. I'd send them first of all to CAST, and actually skip the guidelines and go to, they've 3 questions on the CAST website that you can ask yourself for each principal, and just ask yourself that question for each principal. I would go to understood.org because they have put up some amazing resources about online learning to keep up to date with what is happening with COVID. And then go to your nearest conversation, whether it is your teacher colleagues, whether it is Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is. I know in the States there's UDL Chat. Here in Ireland, we've got UDL Chat IE. And I do think there's a UDL EU as well in Europe. And I've noticed here in Ireland, a lot more teachers have joined our chat since COVID started to ask questions that people who have been practicing UDL for a while can now give them advice on. And I think that's something wonderful and something amazing. So take a breath, don't be afraid to ask the questions, because we all started there at some point.
Thank you, Margaret. Christina, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. You know, so 2 things here with regards to the first question. Another thing that's going on with, so the 2 things that are going on with the teachers in my life are that, one, a lot of them are really feeling fed up with this profession, actually. And so I just really would want to underscore and echo what was said about, like, take a deep breath, take care of yourself, and use the UDL guidelines too. Use some of the principles about what we know about affect and apply some of that to yourself and your self-care in this, like, you know, new environment where you're doing a kind of work that maybe you didn't think you would be doing, you know. But the second thing I wanted to say is that there's a spike in Fs. Grading systems work differently in different countries, but hopefully the F is known pretty ubiquitously around the world as standing for failure, right? And there's a spike in students that are receiving Fs and that are being marked as failing right now. And I think that this provides teachers with a really great opportunity using the UDL guidelines to rethink traditional grading practices, which, you know, hopefully a lot of us, if we've ever been in the position of having to grade others, we know this is very subjective work oftentimes, and oftentimes it's not, you know, concomitant with a sort of rich portrayal of what students know and don't know. So I would really use this as an opportunity too, to like rethink assessment, rethink how you're grading, understanding also that teachers are caught within systems that ask them to do that kind of work. But UDL can kind of provide a rationale when coupled with what we know about the environments that a lot of our students are living through. It can provide a rationale for thinking of ways that you can kind of subvert this system. And to add to that, you know, what I would say to someone who's a newbie or a newbie to UDL right now, part of why I needed a second too for this is, like, I just feel like my head is super caught up right now with like systems level thinking, right? And what is the agency that we all have to different degrees as gatekeepers, as people in positions of power, if we're educators or researchers. And so there's a new book out through CAST on anti-racism in UDL that is really excellent. I'm working my way through it right now. And it's, in my opinion, you know, UDL is also redoing their guidelines to sort of take a more active stance on these social justice issues. And so I actually think this is a great read for anyone who's interested in thinking about how to use UDL to actively take a stand in whatever capacity they can, in whatever position they're in, that works towards advancing social justice.
Thanks, Christina. I'm just going to add a couple of words. Again, I think it's been mentioned before by Margaret, but or by Andrea, to first of all realize that we're all on a spectrum. And certainly during this COVID, we've all placed ourselves on the spectrum of UDL. We've definitely done certain things that were UDL. So just acknowledging that is a feel-good factor. And I think it's important for teachers to actually do that. Look at the framework and look what they do that already fits. And that positions themselves in a winning position, winning conditions to move forward. I think, as you've all said, looking after yourselves, and I think this is a great time to look for communities of practice. As you've said, Margaret, there's a ton of things happening because everyone is feeling fairly vulnerable. So it's a great time to accept that vulnerability and come forward and say, I need a community of practice. I need people to talk about my teaching with and include UDL and inclusion. And the last point is really, again, talk about engagement. I think it's a really great time to rethink engagement and use that third, UDL principle, multiple means of engagement, because we can't really expect the teachers, students to demonstrate that engagement in the regular ways. So this is a great way to, I think, segue into, really engaging richly with that principle, and that leads, I think, people into further sort of reflection. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I thought I'd leave it with a very open question that we can have in discussional format. But as Andrew had already said, it's the beginning. It's only the beginning. There's some great things happening here, and it's only really the tip of the iceberg. How do you suggest we keep the momentum going? Because obviously the fear is that once the vaccine is widely available and this fear goes away, people will just default back to previous practices. How can we keep that momentum going? What would be your thoughts on that? I'll leave it to whoever wants to jump in first. Andrew, do you want to go?
Sure, I'll jump in. Where to start with this one as well, but I think that, again, I'll just mention, I don't think education will be the same. I don't think we're going back to status quo to what it looked like before. I don't think we can even, I just don't think that will ever happen, because we've learned so much, and some of the teachers, even though the conversations I've had, as Christina said, everyone is very much, there's a lot of teachers questioning, being in this profession right now. Such a valid, it's very valid. We are all very, very tired, and, it's been so stressful. But at the same time, I don't think I've ever had a year where I've learned so much. And I think the teachers are echoing that as well, saying, I never thought I could teach like this, but it's just, I'm just learning so much. And some of the things are things that I will not do again, and some of the things that are things that I'm going to carry forward. So I think looking at this as a learning opportunity is really key. And I think moving forward, I think we're going to see many more blended learning models. Going forward, we're going to see excellence in remote instruction, really truly new designs and a lot of interaction. We're going to learn from those teachers that are really, working very hard right now to implement remote learning with a UDL lens. So I'd say that, I think that the practices that we've used for so long that were not very effective, things like, just lecture-based teaching, which is sort of a fallback for many. I think that once we switched to online learning, I think many teachers found that they just couldn't do that anymore. And they're learning from the experience of really integrating different modalities. So I think that teaching has changed now forever. And I'm hoping that in the future, we'll be able to sort of document those changes and really see systemic change moving forward.
Thank you. And Margaret, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. From an Irish perspective, UDL is still very new outside of third level education. So COVID has started the conversation and it started the awareness, but actually now there needs to be some policy, or there needs to be some strategic plan where teachers after COVID will be able, when they've time and they've been able to take that breath, will actually be able to engage in formal training and professional learning around UDL. We need to change the language here in Ireland from differentiation in our policy documents as well, and start moving towards the language of UDL. So while I say teachers are doing it, and Trinity College Dublin, one of our universities here, did a piece of research during the summer on teaching and learning practices at post-primary, so from our 13 to 18-year-olds. And while they didn't use the word UDL in their survey, all of the questions were around the UDL checkpoints. And the teachers had moved towards those checkpoints without knowing they were doing it. So they have the grounding. Now it's time to make it formal, get that government, that national policy, so that teachers can actually embrace it and say, this is part of my job. It's not something I may go and train on, and then it won't become a reality in my classroom or my school. Because if the policy comes in at national, then it'll go down to CPD, go down to school leadership, and in the classrooms where we already know it's happening, albeit virtually or in blended environments.
Thanks. Christina, we're reaching the 1 o'clock, but do you have a few thoughts to close?
Yeah, sure. I would just love to add to that. I mean, it's so important that it be part of policy. And I think related to that, though, that we recognize the intersections with the political intersections, the economic intersections, and the various social intersections that come together in education. UDL, you know, one of the most kind of core lessons that it hammers home is the importance of context. And we've seen the contexts that intersect in schools so clearly, you know, through this pandemic. So I think that to keep kind of pushing on multiple levels, multiple facets of actually like really radical change guided by UDL is what's necessary to keep it relevant, you know, as we go forward.
Thank you, Christina. I'm just going to add two things. I think first, from a leadership point perspective, it's been a great springboard, and I hope a lot of school leaders take that opportunity to continue that momentum forward. They'll feel tired too, but hopefully they keep enough energy to keep this going, because that reflection has been so rich, and it's been a great trigger to move people towards change when sometimes they were very resistant to change. The second thing is there's been, as we've seen, a lot of great creative solutions devised by people. And I really encourage people to publish, publish action research papers, even if it's not a formal journal article, start your own blog, contribute to websites. There's going to be a whole collective lessons that we can learn from this. And it's really important people that keep this documented, that they're able to share it with others, and that we can all learn from those experiences. So on that thought, thank you so much to our three fabulous panelists. And thank you very much for joining. I know people are rushing off. It's been a lunchtime presentation. I think Celine needs to come back on and has a few announcements about the MELM program, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To echo Frederic, yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and you as well, Frederic, for being both the panelist and a host for today's discussion. As Frederic mentioned, and this session today was sponsored by our Educational Leadership and Management programs. So for those of you who asked some questions about our programs, we wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what they look like. So here at Railroads, our Educational Leadership and Management programs are designed to help educators develop critically reflective understanding practices of school improvement, concepts, and research. Our MA is actually an improved TQS, so Teacher Qualification Service Program. So aimed at teachers, administrators within K-12, but also other educational environments who are looking to gain the skills and credentials as leaders to advance in their careers. So if you take a peek at the slide here, you can see that our Master of Arts is 2 years in length, which is comprised of 10 courses resulting in 33 credits. This program can be completed in two ways, so through a thesis or a research paper. And we're really excited that our learners are eligible to apply for an IBO leadership certificate upon completing our program as well. For those who are looking for something perhaps a little shorter in length, or something just to dip your toes and see if this is a world that you'd like to explore, we have our graduate diploma. And our graduate diploma is essentially year one of this 2 years master's program. So the graduate diploma is 1 year in length, 6 courses resulting in 18 credits. And of course, the option to continue on with the master's program if you find you're enjoying your cohort and the teams that you're learning with, or you have the opportunity to take a pause and come back at a time that works better for you. A quick fun fact about these programs is they're actually textbook free. So all of the resources for these programs are provided through open source education resources. And that's something we're really proud of. So if you'd like any more information about these programs, feel free to check out our website, railroads.ca, or connect with our enrollment services teams. Our teams here at Railroads are well versed in these programs, but also any others on our campus as well. So if you're joining us from Canada, our domestic enrollment advisors would be more than happy to chat, and you can find them at learn.more@railroads.ca. And if you're joining us internationally, our international teams are always happy to continue the conversation at learn.more.international@railroads.ca. And for those who had asked some questions about upcoming intakes, we do have them posted on our website, but we wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what 2021 and 2022 looks like. So we're just around the corner, it feels like, from our upcoming MALM intake. So our next intake will begin June 14th, 2021, putting its application deadline at March 14th, 2020. And again, if you have any questions about the program or the application process, we're always here to help. We are so excited to continue today's conversation and answer any questions that you might have about the MALM program on Sunday. Frederic will be hosting a Twitter chat. So to join the conversation, ask your questions on Twitter and use the hashtag MAELM to get connected. You're always welcome to include Frederic and the School of Education and Technology Twitter handles as well, which you can see on the slide and we'll be sure to include in the follow-up communication. And with that, I will pass it back over to you, Frederic.
Well, thank you, Selena, for that update. And thank you again to our three fabulous panelists. And hopefully this conversation can continue in each of your respective schools and school boards. But it is a moment for reflection. So thank you for being trigger agents in getting people to reflect on both the difficulties, but the opportunities that have been present in this crisis and how UDL fits in. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.